Azam is a little bit late.
No problem. أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين وبعد. Before we return to our scheduled topics, there are some questions which were raised last week when I was not here, or apparently they were discussed and they have now been put to me. 3 questions have been asked. Right, the first question. What was the first question? Could you rephrase it again?
In reverse order or the?
In the order in which you asked it originally.
The first question was that what are the differences of, say, Aristotelian logic versus Buddhist logic?
All right, I understand. So the first question that was raised had to do with the nature of logic itself. Is there a kind of nativist Arab logic which was employed perhaps by the Ahlul Hadith in contradistinction to the Greek logic which was adopted by the Mutakallimun of the, say, Mu'tazili or 12 Rishi persuasion? Or is there also something like a Buddhist logic or a Hindu logic? That's the question. And so on and so forth. Chinese logic, American logic. This is actually a very good question. It's an old debate in Islamic thought, and it came up a long time ago. There was someone named Abu Hayyan at-Tawhidi, who was an adib, a man of letters. And he attended or was present during a debate that took place at the court of the Abbasid ruler. And it had to do with the distinction between logic and language. And the debate took place between a grammarian named As-Sirafi and a logician of Christian persuasion, of the Christian faith, probably a Nestorian Christian, I'm not sure, named Matta ibn Yunus. And it has been translated into English and it's there, and so they go back and forth, and of course As-Sirafi is saying no, each language has its own logic, and Arabic has its own logic. And Matta, of course, is arguing that no, logic is a universal. It is independent of language. However, Sirafi kind of makes an idiot out of Matta ibn Yunus in the debate, at least the way that Abu Hayyan al-Tawhidi records it, because he gets him with all of these fine points of Arabic grammar and a language which probably wasn't necessarily his best language. Maybe his best language would have been Syriac, I don't know. At any rate, the correct answer, irrespective of Sirafi's brilliance in Arabic grammar, is that logic is a universal. There is no such thing as a Chinese logic or a Buddhist logic or a Hindu logic. And when people talk about, let's say, logic in the Indic tradition. So in the Indic tradition, I don't really like to talk about it, use the term Hinduism. It's a misnomer. Hinduism is a complete misnomer. I like to say, actually, there's no such thing as Hinduism. Hinduism, the term Hinduism was really something, I think, which was coined by the British colonials because they needed a catch-all kind of phrase to describe a very, very complicated, polyvalent kind of religio-spiritual, philosophical phenomenon. And they wanted to try and understand it by making it into a religion, in the sense that Anglicanism or Anglican Christianity was a religion for them. And it simply doesn't work. So it makes more sense to speak rather than of Hinduism. In fact, Hindu is a Persian word, and it means black. So it just doesn't make sense as a term. And so it makes much more sense to speak in the Indian context, in the Indic context of the Vedic tradition, and then those things in the Indic context which are not part of the Vedic tradition. So that would be Buddhism. The Vedic tradition means any sort of tradition, small t, so Vedic tradition, capital T. And so the Vedic tradition includes any tradition, small t, that accepts the authority of the four Vedas, or at least the Rig Veda, I would say. And there's four Vedas. There's the Rig Ved, there's the Atharva Ved, Yajur Ved, and Sam Ved. Anyway, so these are important. And Buddhism rejects the authority of the Ved, or the Veda, and so it's outside of that. So it's Indic, but it's not Vedic. Now, within the Vedic tradition, you have what are called the 6 darshans, or darshanas, of so-called Indic philosophy or Vedic philosophy. Although the term darshan doesn't mean philosophy. Philosophy, of course, strictly speaking, means love of wisdom. Darshan means a kind of viewing, or, it's...
Experience?
Yes, it's an experiential knowledge. It's a knowledge by mushahada. And moreover, the term Ved, which they always write as Veda with an A in English, but the A is quiescent. It's like a tajweed rule, only comes out when it combines with the word after it. Literally means knowledge, knowing. But it's a kind of direct knowledge. And the word Ved is cognate to the word to the Latin from which we get the English word also, video. All right? So in those 6, there are 6 darshanas. There's the Purva Mimamsa, which is a study of the Veda, kind of linguistic and tafsir kind of thing, study of the Ved. And to that goes the Vedant, because each of these, they come in pairs. Then there's the Sankhya Yoga system, or the Sankhya Yoga system, so that's 4. So you have, and then there's the Nyaya and Vaisheshika. Nyaya is concerned with logic, and Vaisheshika is a kind of physics, you could say. So do they have a different logic? No, they don't. And then there's also so-called Buddhist logic. I mean, if it were different, then how is it that we understand it? It's not something completely alien. And this kind of thesis I find to be quite, frankly, infantile. And it's about as infantile and as the Worf-Sapir linguistic relativity hypothesis. Have you heard of that? There was an early linguist in America named Edward Sapir, and his disciple Benjamin Lee Whorf, who actually had a degree in engineering and was very interested in linguistics, and made early investigations of Amerindian languages such as Hopi. And he came to the conclusion that different languages describe completely different worlds, so that a Hopi Indian experiences the world very differently from a Bengali, for example, or from a Tibetan speaker of Tibetan, or a speaker of French, and what have you. And that their linguistic worlds are incommensurable. And so this is the notion of linguistic relativism. This also simply isn't true. If you have learned many different languages, then you know that often it's impossible to translate literally, but people nevertheless are able to understand one another. And understanding is possible, and the two linguistic worlds are not really incommensurable or impossible to have any kind of dialogue between them. So similarly, I don't think there's any such thing as a different logic. And in the case of in the context of Islamic tradition, I've met people who've tried to make this case that no, the real Islamic logic was invented by Muhammad ibn Idris al-Shafi'i in his famous Risala on Usul al-Fiqh. Well, what's he doing? I mean, it all ultimately, you can bring it all down to syllogisms of some kind or another. So I just find that to be a complete dead end, to say that there's different kinds of logic. So I don't know what that person had in mind from the book that you're quoting. What was it? The translation of the Faslul Maqal.
Oh, it wasn't
the translation
logic in specific. It was reason, the traditions of reason in that book.
The traditions of reason, was that the introduction to the...
In the notes.
Yeah.
But the question of logic is, when people say Buddhist logic, what do they mean by that? Because usually, I've learned as well that logic is universal. If you have to have
Buddhist logic, to the best of my knowledge, and I may be wrong on this, I am not a profound scholar of Buddhism. I have read about Buddhism, but typically, what is very well known as a kind of very famous Buddhist reasoning is a text called the Mula Madhyamika Karika, very hard to pronounce, abbreviated as the MMK, by someone known as Nagarjuna. And it's usually goes by the title in English as Verses on the Middle Way or something like this. So it's a later Buddhist text. Who was Nagarjuna? Good question. In the Indic tradition, it's often very hard to fix historical dates. But his name is associated with this text. Its original should be in Sanskrit, but it really circulates mainly in Tibetan. These are the people who continue to study it. And it is a discourse on the nature of emptiness or shunyata.
Nothingness.
Emptiness or nothingness, but I think emptiness is probably a better way of talking about it. Yeah, because, the Buddhists are not really nihilists. The accusation of nihilism against Buddhism is not really accurate at all. So he has his famous way of arguing for this position of shunyata, or the ultimate emptiness of all things, or the emptiness of all phenomenon. And it involves what is called the tetralemma, where you have two options, and either they're both true, or they're both false, or one is true and the other is another. And so this is known as the famous tetralemma, and that supposedly is Buddhist logic. Well, no, it's logic being used by someone in a Buddhist text. It's not some kind of special logic that we have to somehow acquaint ourselves with, as in if we were actually learning the Tibetan language. There is definitely a structure to the Tibetan language, a grammar, and it would probably be different in many ways. I haven't studied Tibetan from English, right? That's not surprising. And so if you want to learn a language different from the one that you know, obviously you're going to have to learn the rules, the grammar, the syntax, etc. of that language. But logic is a universal. I'm sure that let's take a language very different from English and Arabic and other languages that people in this room would know, classical Chinese, all right? I'm sure that it's possible to make a very simple statement in Chinese, namely, the cat is on the mat. And that statement is either going to be true or false. So the law of non-contradiction applies. So the law of non-contradiction is going to be universal. It doesn't matter what language it is, whether it's English or it's ancient Sumerian or Basque, it doesn't matter. And by the same token, other logical laws will also apply. So this notion that somehow there is this, that there's some kind of nativist Arab logic which Shafi'i and Ahmad ibn Hanbal, were privy to, and that somehow these Mu'tazili mutakallimun and Shi'i mutakallimun were just fascinated and hypnotized by Greek learning. So this is just silly. So that's the first answer to the first question, right? And what was the second question?
The second question was the different traditions of reason.
The different traditions of reason, yes.
So, for example, the Zoroastrian tradition versus the Indic tradition versus the Greek, particularly the Plato-Aristotelian tradition.
Now, yeah, what do you mean by different traditions of reason? What's the question then?
How is that different than the first question?
Yeah, how is it different from the first question?
Right,
so exactly what's in my mind.
Right, exactly. So,
yeah.
So when we talk about reason, we talk about logic.
Mm-hmm.
They're not the same. We're not indicating the same things here.
Mm-hmm.
Or are we?
I mean, if I may ask a
Yeah,
follow-up question.
yeah.
Isn't it logic is kind of a structured, systematic way of using the foundational notion of reason?
Mm-hmm.
Are we applying reason using logic as a structure? Or what else is there?
Look, there are many different ways of defining logic, but I would say that one definition which works in this context is that logic may be defined as the science of necessary inference.
Okay.
Right? And people in different languages and different cultures and different civilizations can draw conclusions from certain premises that are implicit in those premises and strictly follow from those premises and are guaranteed to be true, assuming that those other premises are correct and based on certainties, and that the terms that are used are not ambiguous, etc. The usual kind of conditions that apply. So I'm not sure what you mean by different traditions of reason. If you say that, well, in English we say reason, in Arabic we say aql, and are there different notions of that? Yes, there are. But everyone would agree. I don't think that there is any civilization that does not have some notion, implicit or explicit, of a faculty of reasoning. Now, whether they believe that faculty is based on the intellect, the aql, and the aql is the first thing to be created, as is the case with certain, as is believed by certain people in the Islamic tradition, for example, or that it's some kind of other thing as they have in maybe in the Neoplatonic tradition, these are different matters. Or, for example, the term buddhi in Sanskrit, how is that understood? It's understood differently by the people who follow the Vedanta, for example, as opposed to the people who follow this or that interpretation of Buddhism. That would be there. But all of them would have some notion, which would be common, it is my contention, regarding the rational faculty on the basis of which we can have a science of necessary inference. Because these people argued with one another, there were debates which took place between the followers of what is called Vedanta or the Vedanta and Mahayana Buddhism. There were famous debates between Shankaracharya and representatives of and in those days, if you lost the debate, then you converted to the other school. And so, when they were having those debates, what were they using? What kind of method of argument were they utilizing? The religions of Judaism and Christianity and Islam have very, very, very important differences that separate them one from another. Yet you have a person like Maimonides, Musa bin Maymun, you have Thomas Aquinas, you have Fakhruddin al-Razi, very famous Sunni Ash'ari scholar, you have Nasiruddin Tusi, a 12er Shi'i scholar. All of these people were familiar with so-called Greek logic and had studied it, and they used it to make their arguments about whatever they were arguing. So I don't accept this notion. If that's true, then how come there wasn't some sort of native Jewish logic that Maimonides used, for example, or is there some sort of native Christian logic that Aquinas should have used, as opposed to, Aquinas wrote a whole commentary on Aristotle's posterior analytics. Now, why did he do this? If there's some sort of Christian logic. So I reject this notion. I don't think so. Otherwise, it would be impossible to reason with people. Naturally, let's say if we want to have a debate with Christians or Jews or Hindus or so forth, well, we don't accept each other's texts, really. The Christians don't accept the Quran. We don't accept the Bible as it stands, whatever Bible it is, and the Bible means different things to different denominations and groups, and the Jews understand it separate differently from the Christians and so forth. So we have different revealed sources. So what is going to be the basis of our discussion or our debate? It has to be reason, doesn't it?
No, that's what.
So. So I don't understand when people say that there's completely different and incommensurable notions of reason.
Yeah. Follow-up question on that, much more fundamental. Of course, you alluded to that.
Yes.
Logic, of course, we explained, it's a science of deriving necessary inference using the law of non-contradiction.
Among others, yes.
Yeah,
There's two other basic,
So how do I understand logic is a methodology, a kind of a approach.
It's an instrumental science.
It's
an instrumental science.
Now, what is reason? Reason, is it much broader, vague, whereas logic is much more well-defined? how do I understand these two notions? Logic versus reason, what are they? Are they different in the sense?
Well, logic is an instrumental science. This is the way that it's always defined in Muslim books of logic, that logic is an instrumental science which, when followed, or when its principles are put into practice, it prevents a person from making mistakes in reasoning. All right. So, but when the part which I've translated as reasoning, in that definition, usually the word that's used is fikr or tafkir, thinking, or making mistakes in thought, is maybe another way you would translate it. So the word reason doesn't actually appear, the term aql doesn't actually appear in that definition. So your question then is, what distinguishes the science of logic, ilm al-mantiq, from aql? So ilm al-mantiq, I would say, as an instrumental science, is the application of reason, the correct application, the correct utilization of reason. And reason then, in this sense, will become a faculty. It's a faculty within the human being which permits them to distinguish the true from the false. It's very simple. Does that help you?
Yes.
Yeah. Of course, you can have other elaborations of the concept, because and here this is where language comes in and tradition comes in. So in Arabic, the word aql actually comes from a root which means to bind. And so then you could construe then reason as being that faculty in man, that faculty in human beings that binds them to God. Also, there are some traditions, there are hadiths, which will not be accepted by all Muslims for various reasons, having to do with isnad, having to do with their particular madhab proclivity, that say that the first thing to be created was reason, or aql. But then you come up against translation again, because in English we have different words. We have the word reason, we have the word intellect, and we have the word intelligence. And English is a complicated language. Some of its words are of Greek origin. So many of its words have a Latin etymology, and some of its words have a native Anglo-Saxon etymology. And oftentimes you can have three words that literally will mean the same thing, one from an Anglo-Saxon root, one from a Greek root, and one from a Latin root. But in the actual usage of the English language, they often have different nuances and connotations as opposed to denotations. So that's what you have here with these kind of words. But intellect, usually then when you say the first thing to be created by Allah was the aql, that's typically better to translate that as intellect than as reason. And then of course intellect is the English that comes from the Latin intellectus, which corresponds to the Greek term nous. And the Greeks had a particular understanding of nous. And in this Muslim tradition, when aql is created, Allah says to it to advance, and it comes forward, and it says retreat, and it goes backwards, and then Allah states that aql or intellect then will be the basis of taklif or moral obligation. And you don't have that idea in Neoplatonic thought, where the nous is this thing that kind of moves around. It's almost like it's a conscious being or something, and you don't have that idea. If you actually look at these kind of hadiths, if you can read Arabic, so forth, in the Twelver Shi'i tradition, there's a book known as Kitab al-Kafi. And the al-Kafi is divided into three major sections. There's the usul, or the roots or the principles. It basically has to do with usul ad-din. Then there's furu'. Those are all the usual kind of fiqh hadiths about prayer and fasting and so on and so forth, and hajj, etc., etc. And then you have various kind of statements which are classified into the rawda, or they call it the garden. It's different speeches, khutbahs, so forth, of the different imams. And the very first book in the usul section is called Kitab al-Aql wal-Jahl. So there's a lot of hadiths on aql there. And you find a lot of them also were quoted by Sunni authorities. Like this one is this major one I was referring to is quoted in some form or another by Al-Ghazali as well. So Al-Ghazali has a Kitab al-Ilm in the Ihya Ulumuddin, and these kind of things, if I'm not mistaken, are to be found there. There was also a Sunni authority named Ibn Abi Dunya. He has a Kitab al-Aql. He was a collector of this kind of material as well. It's a very vast subject, and the most erudite treatment of the meaning of aql in Islamic tradition is actually by a colleague of mine named Kareem Douglas Crowe. And he had a very important PhD thesis which he wrote on this subject at McGill University. But he has never McGill University in Canada.
What is the name of the friend?
Kareem Douglas Crowe is my friend and colleague, yes. But he has never published this work, and my understanding is that he is in the process of publishing it. I don't know what progress has been made on this. I haven't been in touch with him in some time. But if you can somehow find a copy of the original thesis, these kind of things are usually available. They were very accessible to me before. If you're teaching at a good institution, you have access to what's called the dissertation database. Anyone can have access to it, but if you're a professor, it's usually free. But if you don't, then the website is called ProQuest, and you can go on ProQuest and you can make a password and all that kind of thing, and you can buy PhD dissertations. You can download them as PDF. They usually charge $30-$40. So, and my understanding is that the Canadian dissertations are there as well. But they are, Canadian, because that would be a Canadian dissertation, yeah.
So what is the title of this book?
I don't remember the title. These PhD dissertations usually have these kind of long titles, but it has, there's not that many Douglas Crowes there. And if you put in Douglas Crowe and you put in, McGill, it should come up. It's about Aql. The Aql will be in the title, and then he also, in the same thesis, looks also at Shi'i traditions as well. So he didn't just look at the Sunni collections. And if I'm not mistaken, he also looks at what the sixth Shiite Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq said. So I think that Ja'far al-Sadiq, the name Ja'far al-Sadiq, may also be in the title, so you could use that as a search term as well. I can check for you what the exact title is if you like, and tell you the next time.
Just out of curiosity, don't worry.
Yeah. It's a very important and erudite text, though, the erudite study. All right, so that's on logic and aql. Now there was a third question.
Yeah, the third question was on the book in specific.
Which book?
On the Boundaries of Theological Tolerance.
Yeah, so On the Boundaries of Theological Tolerance is the English translation by Professor Sherman Jackson of Abu Hamid al-Ghazali's book, Faisal al-Tafriqa Bayn al-Islam wa Zandaqa. So I think the question was about Zandaqa, or the Zindiq.
It was a question regarding, because I remember previously that you mentioned that in that book,
yes,
that Ghazali seems to have made a change.
Yes, I think he did.
In his understanding and judgment of the Muslim philosophy. But reading that book, at least that translated portion, it does not seem to indicate that he's of a different stance, of a significant different stance than he was when he wrote the Incoherence of the Philosophers. So I just wanted to see what the...
All right, I can elaborate on that. So I made the contention in an earlier...
Sorry, I lost my thought on the question.
I am going to summarize the question or restate the question. I made the contention, or I made the claim in a previous lecture that Abu Hamid Muhammad ibn Muhammad al-Ghazali, who died in 505 of the Hijrah, 1111 of the Christian calendar, that he underwent numerous changes in his intellectual and spiritual trajectory, and that the Al-Ghazali of the Tahafut al-Falasifa, that is to say, the Al-Ghazali in the book The Incoherence of the Philosophers, is not the same man who wrote the Ihya Ulumuddin, that he is a profoundly changed individual. This is the kind of claim or argument I was advancing in a previous lecture. And that at the end of the Tahafut al-Falasfa, where he pronounces a takfir against people who believe in certain doctrines, certain philosophical doctrines, he said that, look, most of what these philosophers like Al-Farabi and Ibn Sina have said and the kinds of doctrines they have espoused don't really affect you, don't really affect your status as a Muslim. However, there are three in particular which if a person does espouse, then they go out of Islam. And he says what those three are. One is the eternity of the world, and the second is God's knowledge of the particulars, and the third is the bodily resurrection. So he's making the assertion that the philosophers, people like Ibn Sina, espouse the notion of the eternity of the world, that the world has always existed along with God, and that God's knowledge of particular things is not through particular things as particular things, but through his knowledge of the universals. And the third one was that the rejection of bodily resurrection, that after we die and there is the final reckoning on the Day of Judgment and people will be raised from their graves, that they will be raised in body and soul. And body means the flesh, the muscles, the bones, the sinews, the fingernails, the hair, the eyelashes. It's the whole physical organism. In other words, the body and soul together, the complete psychosomatic complex. Psychosomatic, from the Greek psyche, soul, and soma is body. So the complete body-soul composite. So the idea is that, well, they rejected that and said no, it was only of a kind of spiritual resurrection. Then, much later, he writes a book known as Faisal al-Tafriqa Bayn al-Islam wa Zandaqa, which is Faisal al-Tafriqa, we would translate as something like the last word, or the decisive statement or pronouncement, delineating the difference or the boundary between Zandaqa, between Islam and Zandaqa. So how do you translate Zandaqa? Zandaqa is not really, as you said, Rayyan, and I haven't read Sherman's translation. I've read the original Arabic. But you seem to be indicating that Sherman Jackson translated Zandaqa as crypto kufr or something, or hidden unbelief.
In the title is masked infidelity.
It's masked
infidelity.
Masked, M-A-S-K-E-D, masked infidelity.
In the title. And then in the text, when you...
Then if it's masked, then how do you know what it is?
Again, which I brought the text, so you can actually...
If by masked he means that someone is hiding it, then you don't know. And to hide one's unbelief and profess outward belief isn't zandaqa, strictly speaking. That is by definition nifaq. I don't know. I mean, without having read exactly or asking Professor Jackson what he meant, I don't know. But going on what you were saying, if by masked is meant a kind of implicit unbelief, then fine. But I don't really think that's what zandaqa means. Zandaqa is a word which is imported into the Arabic language actually from Zoroastrianism. And typically when it has been used, according to my own reading and research, and Allah knows best, is that zandaqa is a term that was used more for something like a criminal descent. But then, what distinguishes that from... so it's a kind of loose term, but it seems that's what it originally sort of meant. But it's a very loose term. And anyhow, I prefer not to use it because I don't think it has a very clear meaning. If you really want to talk about someone who is a Muslim, who then has some ideas which lead them to leave Islam, that would be apostasy. And that's ridda, and that's very well understood. So then you have to understand, well, what is meant by ridda? What materializes apostasy in Islamic law? Well, and of course they always speak in general terms. And then there's some who give specific lists, you see. But this is a very problematic area, pronouncing someone who is a Muslim, who says that they're a Muslim, and who at least upholds the principle of prayer and fasting, and the 5 pillars of Islam. That's a very, delicate area. And so, what materializes apostasy? Well, they generally say, well, it would be a denial of any of the daruriyat ad-din, any of the things, the necessary sort of conditions for being a Muslim. If you reject Tawheed, or if you say, well, there's another prophet after the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, these are the kind of things. Well, did the philosophers say that? No, they didn't. And then the assumption of Al-Ghazali is that Islam upholds, on the first point, he is assuming, and I'm not arguing for either position here, so don't misunderstand me. I'm not putting forward my position here. But Al-Ghazali is assuming in that the Quran somehow, that the sam'a, what we call the heard scripture, which is the Quran and correct hadith, and that's the big if the hadith is correct or not, and people differ on these things. But does the Quran, so let's stick to the Quran, does the Quran really uphold the doctrine of creatio ex nihilo, or creation out of nothing? Does it? Al-Ghazali seems to be of the opinion that it does. And therefore, if you go against that, you're going against the Quran. Therefore, you are a non-Muslim. That would constitute something which would materialize ridda. Well, Ibn Rushd actually says that you can interpret it either way. Now, many people will find that hard to believe, and it's beyond the scope of this lecture to go into any of that, but he has a point. You can argue it either way. So is it that the philosophers were espousing one view or another, or are they trying to understand what is the nature of the God-world relationship? How is the eternal related to the temporal, or how is the eternal related to the originated in time? What is the nature of the God-world relationship? That is really what is at stake with that question. As to the second question, the philosophers are not rejecting that God has knowledge of all things. The question that they are trying to understand, or the debate that is going on, is what is the nature of divine knowledge? Obviously, it's not like the way we know things. But so what is its nature? That's what they're discussing under that heading. And then the third question, it's the question of the bodily resurrection. Well, does the Quran really support bodily resurrection? Again, the assumption is that it does. And again, the assumption is that, yes, God has knowledge of all things, but the philosophers never rejected that he had knowledge of all things. It's how does he have knowledge of all things? So I don't see how you can construe that as a rejection of statements in the Quran that say, that his ilm is muhit with everything, or, his knowledge encompasses all things. So similarly with the resurrection, it says in the Quran, for example, Man yuhyi al-'idhama wa hiya ramim. And who will give life to bones after they have been reduced to dust? So that would seem to indicate, well, isn't it possible that it could be a figurative statement as well? When we are resurrected, is it going to be the same physical body that we have? Let's say someone dies when they are 97 years old. MashaAllah, they have a long life. When they are resurrected, are they going to be resurrected when they were in their physical body at the age of 97? Or are they going to be resurrected in their physical body when they were in the prime of their youth, when they were, say, 27, 25 years old? Or what? Or is it some other kind of body? Those are valid questions. And these are the kind of questions that they were dealing with. So to say that somehow in asking these kind of questions and in trying to come up with some sort of answers that they're guilty of kufr, I think that's a stretch. Because people like Al-Farabi and Al-Ghazali and Ibn Sina never, ever, ever claimed to be going against Islam. They never, ever espoused any other religion. They're all on record of always believing in Islam. Ibn Sina is on record that when he would have some kind of a problem with solving a problem, he would go to the masjid, he would pray. When he would solve it, he would give sadaqah. These people are Muslims. You may not like them. You may not agree with them. They aren't with us anymore. If you lived in their time, maybe your personalities wouldn't get along. None of that is relevant. And Al-Ghazali also always claimed to be a Muslim. So, these people have made their contributions. They're no longer with us. And may Allah have mercy on their souls, all of them. They're very important figures. We're still talking about them today. That's all I can say, So the term zandaqa, then, again, just to summarize, I don't know how he understands it. I prefer to avoid the term. And as I said, it's more a question of apostasy. And I think that the case could be made that Al-Ghazali didn't really understand them properly. And that's exactly what Ibn Rushd said. Ibn Rushd said that, Al-Ghazali really didn't understand what these people were saying. Now, mind you, Ibn Rushd did not agree with Ibn Sina's interpretations in philosophy as well. He is a strict follower of Aristotle. But Ibn Rushd nowhere says that these people are kuffar. And he was a jurist. And he was a very serious jurist. He's the author of a book called Bidayatul Mujtahid wa Nihayatul Muqtasid on comparative law.
It's a classic textbook.
It's a very important book.
Major universities.
Anytime you want to look up a question, that's a very good place to start. Anyway, these are my thoughts. I don't know if that's an adequate answer for you, but that's what it is.
itself, Ghazali lays out the 5 levels of interpretation from the very, the very physical interpretation that if it's possible,
Yes.
and if it's not possible, then you go up levels.
Yeah.
So that raises the question: how do you determine if that is possible on a physical level or not?
The resurrection?
Not the resurrection in particular, but in general, right? If something is possible or not to be interpreted at a certain level.
Mm-hmm.
And so he seems to take the stance that this can be interpreted in this level.
Yes.
Therefore, you cannot reject this and go to another level.
His point is, of the multiple interpretation, how to determine which one is possibly the accurate one and the other is not. So I think
if you take a certain position that it is possible.
Yes, well, obviously the philosophers were arguing that their interpretation was the one that had the stronger argument.
Exactly.
Reason work in both.
So it comes back to again. It comes back again to logic and the arguments that you make.
Right, and he doesn't elaborate because it's very brief, and he's not focused on all the Muslim philosophy in particular, but like the rampant apostasy made by all these various groups.
The fact is that the first problem, which is the problem of in Arabic, Islamic, intellectual tradition, it's always referred to as the debate over al-huduth wal-qidam. Huduth being something, being contingent or being originated in time, and qidam as not being originated in time. That's God. So how do you explain the relationship between the two? That's actually one of the most persistent problems in the history of Islamic philosophy. And people have gone back and forth and debated on it for centuries.
What is that? Can you repeat that question?
The question of al-huduth wal-qidam, the question of the God-world relationship, with the question of the relationship between the originated in time and the beyond time or the unoriginated in time.
Semi-eternal versus the temporal?
Yes, these are very important words.
The question is, the world came out of nothingness, or there is some relationship with God's.
That's a consequence.
That's a consequence. That's not the actual question.
Okay.
The question is the relationship.
The question is, what is the in very simple terms, what's the relationship between Allah and the world, the cosmos, the universe?
When you say the world, in what sense? Like when Allah...
The whole universe. The world doesn't mean the planet Earth. It means the cosmos. It means the universe. And the word used in Arabic is alam, al-alam. And in Arabic, al-alam here in this context means everything other than God.
When God was there, angels were there, right? I mean, there's some kind of alam was there, some world. I mean, the earth and the planets, what we see,
Yes.
is created by God when He said be.
Yeah.
Everything came into existence.
Yeah.
So there might be different types of worlds. I mean, He created them.
Yeah, that's not what the word alam means here right now. Al-alam includes everything other than God. Because anything other than God is going to be contingent, whether it's an angel, whether it's the first intellect, whether it's the sphere of Saturn, whatever you want to talk about.
But such knowledge is beyond our reasoning, right? Because, for example, even the science stops at the Big Bang. The science doesn't know what happened before that. So there is a limit.
No, these are all, popular conceptions that people have about science. That simply, if you actually start going into it and reading about modern cosmology and so forth, you will find also that there is not a consent. The so-called ijma' among physicists today is about the so-called Big Bang, but it has a lot of problems as a theory. If you look into it, there are people who dissent from it. They're in the minority. I mean, the whole Big Bang theory really is. It takes the absurd notion that gravity is the most decisive force in the universe, and it's not. It's not. It's actually a very weak force.
It's known as a weak force.
It's a very weak force. I mean, and I can demonstrate that right now. If you give me a magnet, and I can just pick up a paper clip, it's here, and so it's overcome the force of gravity. So, I mean, it's a very large field. There's differences of opinion on these things, but really the question is that really beyond our reason? No, it's not beyond our reason. It's not beyond our reason. People have discussed it. People have talked. It may be beyond the average person's competence or interest. That is irrelevant. But there are people who are interested in the subject, and there are people who are qualified to discuss and debate about the subject on many different levels.
When I say beyond a reason, I mean there are multiple answers, and and then it starts with the people's inclination to accept this or accept that, and it's like, for example, the relationship with the eternity, the divinity with the temporal world, or eternity. These things are. Reason can go in different ways, and this inclination take over, and people follow this and follow that. No one can say he is wrong, because as you mentioned, Ibn Rushd has a point, because it can be interpreted in two ways, and Al-Ghazali took the later, and
But he also said that even though it can be argued both ways, one way is right and the other one is wrong, according to him also. Yeah. He doesn't agree with Al-Ghazali.
No, yeah,
he takes the position. He basically supports Aristotle, and anyway, this thing has been debated back and forth for a long time. And one of the most interesting responses was given by the person we're supposed to be discussing today, the teacher of the person we're supposed to be discussing today, which is who was Mir Damad. Mir Damad wrote a whole treatise on this subject called the Kitab al-Qabasat. And the whole thing is devoted to this problem. And then, Mullah Sadr has his own view, and anyhow. So, people like Ibn Sina never said that God did not create the world, but, what does it mean to say that he is the creator of the world? Is he temporally prior? Is he logically prior? And these are things which people usually don't think about, and many people, honestly, the average person usually has difficulty even understanding the question. So,
People have difficulty understanding and accepting Ghazali. Forget about that.
And also terminology comes into play. So some terms people use a philosophical definition versus a theological one, and there's no understanding them.
Yeah.
I have one question.
Yes.
What is the standing of tradition, the hadith in front of Ibn Rushd? Do they take it like Quran, or this seems like because in hadith there are instances where Prophet said that when a man is raised, he will have age of Yusuf al-Salam, right? So like 40 years or something like that. So there are hadiths. So Ibn Rushd seems to, like, listening to you, he took Quran over the hadith and didn't accept it. And Imam Ghazali seems to accept the hadith.
No. All of these people accepted hadith in the sense that they accepted the sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Now, if you have an individual hadith report, they may accept it and they may not accept it. And everybody has their own system, and these guys were, mujtahideen and so forth, and they had their own approach to it. And that's an area of tremendous controversy among Muslims to this day. Do you accept this hadith? Do you not accept this hadith? And that's what many of the debates, particularly among Sunni Muslims, are about nowadays. They come down to hadith and how you evaluate those hadith. And then there's a kind of naive understanding among average Muslims of, well, this is Sahih hadith, it's in Sahih Bukhari, therefore it is true. And it's a whole other area of discussion. So suffice it to say, no, none of these people rejected hadith, but they evaluated the hadiths according to their own expertise in the subject. That would be the
dispute, because does a hadith with a single chain have the same
veracity
and
authority
as one that comes from mutawatir chain?
Yeah.
And if they're complementary, how do you
And I think these are very well discussed and defined in those usul.
No, they're thoroughly discussed, but they're not well defined by anybody.
Okay.
The fact is
Like mutawatir is-
that if you get into the debate over whether you accept a so-called solitary tradition, what's called solitary traditions, or what's called akhbar ahad, as opposed to akhbar mutawatira, then there is no unanimity.
Yeah, no ijma on that.
There's no unanimity on what constitutes a mutawatir tradition, and there's a vast range of disagreements in this area as well.
Now, I want to go back and probably add on point on the earlier topic.
Yes.
See, the human effort to understand what the Quran means.
Yes.
And Allah SWT says in the Quran itself about the paradise, there's a lot of description, but yet Allah SWT says, no eyes have seen, etc. So, yet there is a description given, yet Allah SWT elsewhere says, we don't know what really, the reality of that, what the paradise description given in the Quran is.
Uh-huh.
So, is that, of course, we can apply to that broadly to every verse in the Quran, but then the whole human effort to understand and apply falls apart.
Mm-hmm.
However, that notion is there. Okay, now the question is that notion of the lot of language trying to explain something unexplainable and understood in this world.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, what is the scope of that? That exists in the Quran, many topics. Question is how far that can go. So some of the interpretation of the ghaib may fall into that category. So human beings still make an effort to understand what is the relationship. In there, is it required for ordinary Muslims to practice? No, but these are intellectual questions when we other religion, Islam versus other religion, other notion of ideas, other notion of reality. These things will come up
Yes.
for sure. That's the one point I want to just add.
All right, so it's just a comment. You're just saying that the descriptions of paradise and hell, they use language and they use words and they talk about things which we have experience of in this world, such as fire or happiness or bliss or pleasure of different kinds of foods and whatnot. So are we how do we understand those? Well, obviously, as you've said, there's a range of meanings between the literal and the metaphorical. And at the same time, it will be like nothing which we have in the world today. If you think about it, how is it that someone can be continually roasted in a fire and their skin they don't completely incinerate? Eventually, for example, if you incinerate a dead body, nowadays using the most modern means, it takes about 2 hours. Yeah, no. Well, there are actually engineers out there who design these things for funeral home. Obviously, alhamdulillah, we don't believe in cremation. But if you have the most modern means, if you don't, it's going to take you a while, like the Hindus on the banks of the Ganga in Banaras, or, it takes them probably a lot longer.
Yeah.
If you have the most modern means, apparently it takes 2 hours. All right, so how is it that someone who is mukhallad, who's going to be in Jahannam, la qadr Allah, and may Allah save us all, and be roasted in perpetuity so that their skin, how is that possible? So again, it's got to be some kind of metaphor. It's that the fire which is there is far more real, shall we say, or far more, I don't know. Again, language breaks down, doesn't it? It's far more severe. It's completely different from any kind of fire that we know, right? Because ultimately things are going to burn up and be gone and reduced to some other constituents of matter. But this is a different kind of fire, and the skin is regenerated, and that's the explanation we give, and we believe in it. But obviously there's some sort of, it's just an image, it's an approximation or something of what that experience is going to be.
So does it imply universals
I don't know.
then? Does it imply universals?
Apply universal.
Does that imply universals? Because if it says fire, and our understanding of fire is in this physical realm, then how does it apply to the hereafter? Is there some universal archetype that applies to both?
I really don't know. I really don't know if
These
there's
are our
some.
conjectures.
These are there. Yeah, it's really an area of conjecture more and speculation than than certainty.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you're applying to Plato's idea of
No, I'm just saying, like, does it?
So the question is,
Yes.
Do we get back to our course of syllabus or continue?
It's up to you. I mean,
this discussion is a foundation for what
well, we were stuck somewhere before on Avicenna, and then we didn't meet last week because I wasn't well, and then we were just in the process of finishing off Ibn Sina, and then if we do that, then we go into Mulla Sadra. So what should we do?
Certainly, I personally would like to hear from you commentary on
Mullah
Sina first, before that
Okay.
proceed, right?
Yeah, so we were in Al-Fasl al-Khamis, section 5, or Michael Marmura calls it chapter 5, which is في الدلالة على الموجود والشيء وأقسامهما الأول بما يكون فيه تنبيه على الغرض. Michael Marmura translation of the title on indicating the existent, that's al-mawjud, the thing, ash-shay, and their first division wherewith attention is directed to the objective sought. So we'll just go over this briefly. And this is just meant to be a kind of entryway, provide us an entrance into Mullah Sadra, who really looked at these things in the most profound way. So the first point in this section 5 or chapter 5, Al-Fasl al-Khamis, is that being cannot be defined. Being is not capable of definition. He says, إِنَّ الْمَوْجُودَ وَالشَّيْءَ وَالضَّرُورِي معانيها ترتسم في النفس ارتساما أوليا. In other words, what he means is the notion. He doesn't use the word notion here in Arabic. He just says the existent. So Marmura has added the word the ideas. It's understood. But I would prefer to speak of the mafhum of these things. Mafhum meaning notion. So I would say that the notion of quote unquote the existing thing, or of an individual existing thing, al-mawjud, as well as the notion of quote unquote the thing, or a thing in general, as well as the notion of the necessary, quote unquote the necessary. So this whole business about use and mention in logic, he's putting they don't really have punctuation in Arabic until modern times, and even in modern times it's kind of very personal. You can punctuate various ways, but when he says innal mawjud, the word mawjud should be or in quotation marks, which is why in the English translation he's put quotation marks, the translator. So the point is that all of these notions impress themselves upon the soul, an-nafs, in a very primary way. And this impression, which is made in this very primary way, is in no need of some other things which are better known than the terms mawjud, shay, and daruri, or the existent, the thing, and the necessary, to be understood. There is an immediacy in the understanding of what is meant by these terms. In other words, there is a fundamental ontological intuition that everyone already has when speaking about these terms, al-mawjud, al-shay, and al-daruri, or the existent, an individually existing thing, in other words, the thing and the necessary. So he goes further in the sections, in the paragraphs that follow in this chapter, when he begins to refute various definitions that are offered, of existence or of al-wujud. So one of the famous definitions or ways of trying to define wujud or being is that being or existence, al-wujud, is the affirmed in itself, and that non-being or non-existence, or what's called al-adam, would be the negated in itself, or as that which can be the object of predication. And then, of course, non-being would be that which cannot be the object of predication. Excuse me. So all of these attempts at definition of wujud, and then also concomitantly of adam, all involve on some level a vicious circle, in the sense that they use the term that they're trying to define in the definition, and that these attempts at definition are merely instances of lexical substitution, because there can be nothing more well known than being. And being or existence, al-wujud, has neither genus nor species, and therefore cannot be rigorously defined in accordance with the Aristotelian logic of concepts, which is what is involved in the Aristotelian...
Sorry, apologize.
No problem. The Aristotelian logic of definition. So al-wujud cannot be defined. That's according to the divisions, and mind you, these divisions are not there in the original text. This is what modern editors and I think in this edition, you see, the edition produced by Brigham Young University Press, which includes the translation by Michael Marmura, has paragraph divisions, and those paragraph divisions are not in the critical edition of the Ilahiyat of the Kitab al-Shifa, which was published in Cairo whenever it was published, 1960, 1380. Ilahiyat al-Amma li-Shu'un al-Matabi' al-Amiriyya. So the original critical edition was published in 1380 of the Hijrah, or 1960, with the the edition was produced basically by Georges Anawati. Anyway, so in this Brigham Young University edition, they have paragraph divisions, and it's in paragraphs 6 through 9 of chapter 5 that these definitions of wujud are refuted. So he says, فَهَذِهِ وَمَا يَجْرِي مَجْرَاهَا فَهَذِهِ وَمَا يَجْرِي مَجْرَاهَا لَوَاحِقُ الْوُجُودِ بِمَا هُوَ وُجُودٌ. These things and their like are the sequels of the existent, inasmuch as it exists. Because the one is coextensive with existence, it also becomes necessary for us to examine the one, and so forth. So, I mean, you can read through all of this, but essentially 6 through 9 are just refutations of attempts to define being, as well as attempts to define things which are coextensive with being. So there are certain things which are coextensive with being, and he has mentioned them already in section 1, when he says that
when you use the word being, you meant wujud, right?
I mean wujud, and he's a bit he's not completely wrong when you use al-mawjud and wujud interchangeably, because for Ibn Sina, for Aristotle also, the reason that substances which in Arabic will be jawahir. We don't. You should remember now. We're not going to go over again substance and accident. Okay.
Yes.
But substances, what is denoted by the Greek term ousia, and are really what are fundamental for Aristotle, and it seems to be also kind of playing the same sort of thing seems to be playing out with Ibn Sina when he says al-mawjud. So for Aristotle, he's studying al-mawjud as al-mawjud in as much as it exists, and not in as much as it is the individual man or horse or chair or tree or shrub or book or pencil. He's studying individually existing things as existing things, irrespective of what they actually are, but simply by virtue of the fact that they exist. You see? Yes, question?
No.
Oh, you're just stretching your hand. Yeah. So he's not completely wrong, but the point is that I was making now is that it's impossible to define wujud, and therefore it's also impossible to define those things which are coextensive with it. And among the things which are coextensive with wujud are thingness or thinghood or ash-shay'iyya.
What is the word for accident in Arabic?
The word for accident in philosophical terms in Arabic is arad. Ain ra dad. Arad. Plural a'rad. And substance is jawhar. Plural jawahir. So ash-shay'iyya or thingness. So in Arabic you can take the word ash-shay, which means the thing, and then you can form thingness or thinghood, ash-shay'iyya. So being or al-wujud is coextensive with thingness. That is to say that thingness cannot be actualized without being. Thingness cannot be actualized without existence. Okay? The same applies to things like, well, first of all, do you understand that thing is a very general term? It's just like the term existent. Everything which exists is an existent, is an existing thing. So you see how, again, we're using the word thing. So the word thing applies to human beings, to animals, to inanimate objects, to this individual chair, to eyeglasses, to pencils, to pens, to coffee cups, to tea kettles. It applies to everything. So it's like being. So it's coextensive.
It doesn't apply to ideas.
Yes, it
Like
does.
justice,
It does.
beauty.
Yes, it does. Justice is a thing. Beauty is a thing. They even use it now in a colloquial sense. Is that a thing? That's a thing now. How is that a thing? It's a very, 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 very general term. Just like wujud, just like being, just like existent. The same applies to one or unity. So the term one, wahid, is also coextensive with being. Now how is that? It is coextensive in as much as each individual thing is one thing. Even if it might be a multiplicity. A dozen eggs is a thing, and I know that there's 12 in that group. It's irrespective of whether you have a carton or a box. You could have 12 eggs in a bag. You could have 12 marbles in a bag. You could have 1,000,000 marbles in a bag. But it would be a bag of marbles. You see? So similarly, I don't know, they have these things, for example, these designations in the military. So there's a division, there's a brigade, there's a squad. I don't know how many soldiers are actually in each one, but one speaks of them as a unit. And similarly, all of them together, one speaks of the army in its totality of all soldiers in the army, the Air Force, the what have you, or the workforce. Similarly, I don't know how many of these paper notes are in circulation in America. There's a lot of them. But they also speak of it in aggregate, don't they, as the money supply. So it's also a unity. So every multiplicity, under some principle of organization, can be conceived of as a unity. Very important, these things. So this is the kind of thing which Ibn Sina is alluding to then in Paragraph 6 through 9 is the refutation of proposed definition of being. Then he introduces the notion of quiddity.
Before we go, on page, paragraph 8, I will struggle to understand.
Paragraph 8 is on page 21, yes.
So the meaning of existence and the meaning of thing are conceived in the soul as two meanings, whereas the existent, the established, and the realized are synonymous.
What page are you on? This is a long paragraph. It actually extends from pages 21 to 22. Paragraph 8.
Paragraph 8. No, that is on page 24. Chapter 5.
Okay, so this is 25.
Page 24.
This is a double-sided copy. Excuse me, I was on the wrong.
In chapter 5, if you go to paragraph 8.
Yeah, page what and line number, please.
Line number approximately. Page 8 is, paragraph 8 is a small paragraph.
Oh, yeah, okay, now it is. Yes, I'm sorry, yeah. All right. Moreover, we say the meaning of existence and the meaning of thing are conceived in the soul and are two meanings. Sorry, I was in the other chapter. Whereas the existent, the established, and the realized are synonyms, we do not doubt that their meaning has been realized in the soul of whoever is reading the book. So what's the question?
I couldn't fully grasp that paragraph. What he's trying to say here.
ونقول in Arabic إن معنى الوجود ومعنى الشيء متصوران في الأنفس وهما معنيان والموجود والمثبت والمحصل أسماء مترادفة على معنى واحد ولا نشك في أن معناها قد حصل في نفس من يقرأ هذا الكتاب. So yeah, we understand that those are two different words, and we understand them as being two different words, and each having its meaning. However, they're synonymous. You know, it's just like saying that. It's like saying. That writing instrument, for example, here of course there's going to be a difference in generality, but you can imagine similar synonyms in your mind. So if you have a writing instrument, that's also a pen. So he's saying a similar sort of thing here, except writing instrument is more general than pen because it would include pencil, it would include probably chalk, mechanical pencils, fountain pens, ballpoint pens, etc. But he's saying that even though these are two words and we recognize them as two words, they are in fact synonymous. So if two words are synonyms, that doesn't negate the fact that there are two words.
Yeah, that part is
yes.
My confusion came
yes.
because the translation says the meaning of existence and the meaning of thing. So I interpreted from that it's not talking about the two different words, but the meaning of those two words. So maybe, I don't know whether that is what is intended in the original Arabic text.
Yeah. No, we still understand them as two meanings in our mind, but we recognize that the two meanings merge together. That's what he means, I think. That's what it means to be a synonym. Yeah. So, look, this is really the essential point. Then he introduces the notion of quiddity and analyzes it in a way similar to how he analyzes being. Then that's in paragraph 10, where you have the notion, the notion of quiddity is introduced in paragraph 10. So he says, okay, let's get back to what we were talking about. We've disposed of these attempts to define being. Now let's get back to the main subject. And having talked about being, now I have to introduce the idea of quiddity. To resume, we say, it is evident that each thing has a reality proper to it, namely its quiddity. It is known that the reality proper to each thing is something other than the existence that corresponds to what is affirmed. So he says, let's get back. وَنَرْجَعُ فَنَقُولُ إِنَّهُ مِنَ الْبَيِّنِ أَنَّ لِكُلِّ شَيْءٍ حَقِيقَةٌ خَاصَّةٌ هِيَ مَاهِيَّتُهُ وَمَعْلُومٌ أَنَّ حَقِيقَةَ كُلِّ شَيْءٍ الْخَاصَّ بِهِ غَيْرَ الْوُجُودَ الَّذِي يُرَادِفُ الْإِثْبَاتِ.
So this is basically the difference between the mawjud, the individual thing, versus the universal, right? Is that what he's talking on paragraph 10?
Well, essentially he's bringing in the notion of quiddity distinct from being. So when you talk about an individually existing thing, when you talk about a mawjud, it is an existing thing. And it is an existing thing because by definition it has wujud as an existing thing. However, this existing thing, call it X, something, is different from this other existing thing, call it Y. But they both exist. So wujud, that the fact that they exist is a principle of unity between them, in as much as they are existing things. And so the term mawjud applies to them. And the term thing applies to both of them as well. Yet, X is different from Y. How is X different from Y? The principle then of multiplicity and of differentiation is quiddity. And quiddity, or mahiya, comes exactly from the question in Arabic that you would ask, what is it? Ma huwa, or mahiya. And that's exactly where the Latin also, in Latin, quiddity is an English word taken from the Latin quidditas, I think. And in Latin also you would ask, I believe, quid est, I think, is in Latin. I'm not a Latin scholar. Probably that's what is or something near like it, and with all due apologies to Latin scholars. But that's where it comes from. And in Arabic it's exact translation, same in Latin, what is the thing? So when you are asked what is X, you say, for example, it's a palm tree. What is Y? It is an ocean, for example, whatever. It doesn't matter. So each thing is distinguished from another thing by virtue of certain qualities specific to it. And those also are the quiddity. So the quiddity is what is said in Arabic. They say, fi jawab ma huwa. It's what is said in answer to the question, what is it? And it's at the same time those particular qualities that make it what it is. So you have, so there's a coffee cup over there on this table, for example, right? So this coffee cup it's a paper cup. It's made of a certain kind of paper. It has a particular circular cross-section at the top, a particular circular cross-section at the bottom, and that circular cross-section has a particular radius, and the one on the bottom has a particular radius as well, and it has a lid, and it has a certain height, and you can calculate the volume, and you can, and it's made of paper. It has a particular point at which it will ignite, and it has all of these physical properties that make it what it is and distinguish it from some other thing. That is all of that is the quiddity, you see. So that's what he is introducing in paragraph 10. The notion of quiddity is introduced in paragraph 10. And then the points which were raised in paragraph 6 through 9 are revisited in some fashion here. And I don't know if there's any much point in going into that. The main point is that he has clearly made a very important distinction. This is what I would like you to understand here, between being and quiddity. So on the level of conceptual analysis, everything is a kind of ontological composite. And a later day commentator of the school of Mullah Sadra, of Transcendent Wisdom, Al-Hikmat Al-Muta'aliya, Mullah Hadi Sabzawari, says that everything is a zawjun tarkibi. It's an ontological composite of two things. An ontological bicomposite, if you like, of... Zawj means pair. Zawjun tarkibi, yeah. And so it's an ontological bicomposite, composed of two elements, quiddity and being. And this is on the level of conceptual analysis. In the external world, we are only confronted by individual quiddities. And so we can approach those individual quiddities in terms of being. And that is the principle of unification. And that's why probably that Aristotle saw those as those quiddities, or what he also called what is called substance. That the individual substance really, or usia, was what he wanted to study. And of course in Arabic that's jawhar, because the usia or the jawhar exists, and its existence is more primary and fundamental than that of accidents. And many of those accidents also go up into what is the mahiyya of a thing, because the thing might be a particular height, it might be a particular color. And so these are qualities which are also existing things, but they don't have the same degree of existence as the substance, because they need the substance. They need the substrate, or the substratum in Latin, in which to inhere. You cannot speak of blueness independent of a blue rock, for example. Okay? So you have this distinction. But these are all existing things nevertheless. So you can distinguish, this is the important point here in Ibn Sina, that you can, on the level of conceptual analysis, distinguish, given any existing thing, between its existence, between its wujud and its mahiyya. But that is on the level of conceptual analysis. In the external world, we are confronted with individually existing things. This is a key distinction.
Previous statement.
Repeat the previous statement?
Yeah. Not in this external world, but
Yeah.
before that you made a statement. In its reality, there is the.
In the external world, we are confronted only by individually existing things.
Yes.
And it is in our brain, in our mind, in our heart, that we subject them to a kind of analysis, whereby through our thinking process, in our mind, we are able to distinguish, break apart, if you will, each thing into two constituent things,
Okay.
quiddity and existence.
Sorry.
Yeah. So everything is a kind of ontological bicomposite. And so you have in each individually existing thing its existence and its quiddity, or its wujud and its mahiyya. This is a very important distinction.
So in the unity and the accidents and Aristotle,
Mhm.
they are same in a way. Unity is very much substance.
Quiddity is very much substance. Yeah.
Substance is much more universal.
Substance is a bit more universal, yeah. Excuse me.
So everything, in a sense, in our mind, be subject to its individual that existence, wujud, and its mahiyya, its quiddity.
Yes.
That's the two pairs of any item to understand.
Yeah, yeah. So the key point then to take away from this is this distinction. And you should also keep in mind that non-being or non-existence and wujud are complete contraries. They're completely mutually exclusive from one another. And much of what we have said about wujud in terms of its the impossibility of defining it applies also, the necessary adjustments being made to non-being. Then in paragraph 19, again, he reiterates again, he makes this conclusion. He said, all right, having gone through all of this, once again we would like to state that the existent thing, the thing, and the realized are all coextensive or concomitants of one another.
One question.
Yeah.
On the paragraph 17,
Mm-hmm.
one second. Paragraph 17, page 26.
Uh-huh.
Those who uphold the view, there are matters in the assembly of bodies being informed about and known that in the state of non-existence have no thingness. So here in that sentence, maybe some people hold the view that there are matters in the assemblage of what is being informed about and known that in the state of non-existence have no thingness. Meaning, what that is, what I understood what that is trying to say is non-existence, meaning there's no wujud for that.
Yeah.
Is that what he's saying? That
Yeah. Essentially, yes. That's really all that he's saying.
And Shabzawari's comment on everything has
Whose comment?
Shabzawari?
Yes.
His comment on the how did you phrase it? The pairs?
Sabzawari? Oh yeah. What, in Arabic?
In English, how do you
He said that everything is a zawjun tarkibi. The way, how did I say it in English? I said ontological bicomposite.
Right.
Yeah.
So does that he derive it from like everything is created in pairs?
No. Don't.
Still in the substance itself is there spirit.
Yeah.
That's
No, he's not going from there.
no. See, it has two components. One is on the lower level, the actual thing, and the higher level of that substance, which is kind of an abstracted universal. So everything has these two pieces to it to understand its ontological existence.
Right.
That's what
Everything on the level of conceptual analysis can be broken down into two things, two elements: the wujud and the mahiyya, the being, the existence, and the quiddity. So I don't want to be to dwell then further on
One more paragraph, if I may ask.
non-being and so forth. And as I said, the question you just asked is there in paragraph 21, that basically al-mawjud is mahiyya, is jawhar. In other words, existence is quiddity, is substance. Yeah. Sorry, you were going to say?
On the paragraph 19, the conclusion he makes. Hence, it's page 27.
Yeah.
Hence, you have now understood the way in which the thing
There's from what is, yeah.
differs from what is understood by the existent and the realized, and that despite this difference, the two, that is the thing and the existence,
Are necessary concomitant. Yeah.
concomitants.
Yeah.
I'm struggling to really, digest this. Are they saying here? Are they just mean they're synonyms for the same reality?
They're synonyms for the same reality, but they are mutalaziman. There is talazum. There is a concomitancy. The one follows from the other. So if we take this folding chair here that's in front of us, then this is an existing thing. We can conceive of it in terms of its existence. At the same time, it is also a thing, and it might be different from another thing. And it's also a realized thing. It is hasil. It is here. It is assembled. It's been manufactured. It exists. So you can see that the term hasil, or the realized, is the same as the thing as the existent. Even though those are different terms. And for an individual existing thing like this chair, we may approach it, as it were, under these different terms with a slightly different nuance. But each of those terms follows from the other. And they are, in a sense, equivalent. They are concomitants. They are coextensive. Coextensive means that they have the same, they have a common extension in the external world. They have the same referent. So, even though we might have different notions in our mind that, well, the existent is a notion, the thing is a notion, and the realized is a notion, when we take an individual thing, those terms all have the same referent in the external world. They have the same misdaq, which in our example here is this folding chair. That's all it is. So that is pretty much it. The thing to understand at the end of this, which is paragraphs 22 through 24, near the end, it goes up to paragraph 27, is that there are three fundamental ontological modes, namely the necessary, the contingent, and the impossible. And he says there's a similar kind of circularity involved in trying to define these. He says, وَجَمِيعُ مَا قِيلَ فِي تَعْرِيفِ هَذِهِ مِمَّا بَلَغَكَ عَنِ الْأَوَّلِينَ قَدْ يَكَادُ وَيَقْتَضِي دَوْرًا. I think that's what it is anyhow. It's in paragraph 22. Where's the English? وَجَمِيعُ مَا قِيلَ. All that has been said of the things that have reached you from the ancients in defining this would almost entail circularity. This is because, as you have come across in the various parts of the logic, whenever they want to define the possible, they include in the definition either the necessary or the impossible. In other words, whenever you want to define any of these three ontological modes, you will involve the other mode in trying to define it, and so you have a similar kind of circularity
I thought that
involved.
whole paragraph is going round and round.
That's the point.
Yeah.
That is the point. Going round and round is the point, that when you try and define it, you will end up going round and round. So those three ontological modes also cannot be defined without involving circularity. That's what I've said it in one sentence. Okay. Finally, 25 through 27, paragraphs 25 through 27, concern the impossibility of the non-existent being brought back into existence. I don't want to spend any time on this because it's not really relevant to our discussion. So you can ignore 25 and 27. It's important, but it's not important to where we are trying to go. And I have another 15 minutes. So we can begin to talk about Mulla Sadra. But today, unfortunately, I cannot have an extended session with you because I must be somewhere by 2:15. And I apologize, otherwise I would have been more than happy to stay, but I have an important appointment. So those of you who came a little bit late, I want to make it clear that next time, I think you weren't here when we agreed on this, we will have a double session because we missed one day and we want to make it up. So we will have a double session on Saturday. Is that okay with you?
What time starts?
We'll start the same time, but and then we'll break for namaz, for salat, and then if anyone wants to have a tea or go and grab something quickly to eat, we'll about an hour or so. Then we'll come back and we'll do another session.
That's good.
Is that good? That way we will have done everything. So
And also, sorry,
yeah, go ahead.
what we need to read about Mullah Sadra.
Well, I don't have something for you to read on Mullah Sadra. I have. I can actually email you if you like. I have some notes which I prepared. All right. Wallahu a'lam. Oh, now it's okay. So now we're talking about Mullah Sadra. Yes. Well, Sadruddin Muhammad al-Shirazi, or Mullah Sadra as he is known, is an extremely important figure in the history of Islamic philosophy, and I really consider him to represent what we may call the high watermark of Islamic philosophy. Rayhan, you may have these notes back. Yes, so Sadruddin Muhammad al-Shirazi, or Mullah Sadra for short as he is known, is considered to be the founder of what is called the School of Transcendent Wisdom, or Al-Hikmatul Muta'aliya in Arabic. Mullah Sadra lived in, or flourished in the Safavid period in Iran. It was a period of tremendous efflorescence, cultural efflorescence, intellectual efflorescence. And Mullah Sadra is one of the key figures of something called the School of Isfahan. The School of Isfahan, okay, is that different from Transcendent Wisdom? School of Isfahan really isn't one school. It's a convenient kind of catch-all term which really was originated by the French scholar Henry Corbin, and then popularized by someone named Sayyid Hussein Nasr. But I think that Corbin Corbin is American pronunciation. His French is something like Corbin, something like that. He really came up with this idea. So this is a group of people, and Mullah Sadra is one of them, and he's more kind of the younger figure in this constellation of men of great erudition. And these are the figures of Mullah Sadra's two main teachers, namely Mir Muhammad Baqir Damad. Did I tell you? Yeah, Mullah Sadr died in 1050. Did I say that?
No.
Sorry. So Mullah Sadr died in the year 1050 of the Hijrah. You should always know that I always give the Hijrah date first. And I usually don't even give the other dates, but I prefer to use the Hijrah calendar when talking about Islamic history. So Mullah Sadr died in the year 1050, which corresponds to the year 1641 of the Christian calendar. Excuse me. Yes, so he is one of the figures in the so-called school of Isfahan, and then there's the major figures are his two teachers. There's Mir Damad, Mir Muhammad Baqir Damad, and he was a Husaynid Sharif. He was a descendant of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. His teacher Mir Damad, and Mir Damad died about 10 years before him. Before Mullah Sadr. So Mir Damad died in 1041, or approximately 1631 of the Christian calendar. 1041 Hijrah, 1631 Christian calendar. Now, so Mir Damad was his teacher in, I would say, mainly in the so-called rational sciences, al-ulum al-aqliya. And he had another teacher, Baha'uddin al-Amili, who was a very important scholar. Both of them really were men of great erudition, both Mir Damad and Sheikh Baha'uddin al-Amili, who is also known as, especially in Persian, as Sheikh Baha'i. But I prefer not to use that designation. I won't use it again because people think it has something to do with the Baha'is, which are a completely heterodox and movement that has really nothing to do with Islam, despite any of their claims, so we won't use that, and that's all we have to say about that. So Sheikh Baha'uddin al-Amili was, like Mir Damad, a man of encyclopedic learning and far-ranging erudition. And so, as was Mir Damad, they were both scholars of the Sharia in their own right. They were both scholars of Hadith. They were both well-versed in mathematics. And Baha'uddin al-Amili, like Mir Damad, they have this kind of legendary quality to them. Baha'uddin al-Amili also, when he worked on astronomy, mathematics, he has a very important text on arithmetic, in fact. He wrote on astronomy. He even worked on architecture, design. He said that he even designed various gardens in Isfahan. So these were figures of an all-embracing and a kind of universal wisdom. So these are the two main influences on Mullah Sadra. There was another extremely learned figure in Isfahan at the time named Mir Findariski. Now, all of these people had this thing in common, that they were students of, not direct students, mind you, but they were students of the works, of the writings, of the philosophy, of the thought of Ibn Sina. And so they were all in some capacity or another involved in teaching and studying books like the Kitab al-Shifa and another book of Ibn Sina called the Al-Isharat wa Tanbihat. These really are the two main books of Ibn Sina in philosophy. And they're very, very important. And you were very fortunate that both are now available in English. At least the Shifa, the Ilahiyat portion, the big fat book I brought that time. And also I just found out that the physics portion of the Shifa is a big book. I brought in my copy of the Shifa, right? The Ilahiyat of the Shifa. So you can see it's a pretty tall book. And if you put all the volumes together, it takes up about, and they're all this size, it takes up about 14 inches of linear space on the shelf. So the Physica, or the physics section, has also been translated into English in the same series, also a very thick book. It's pretty expensive. It's hardcover. I think it sells for $80 or something. But the Isharat has also been translated, but it's been translated by different people and bits and pieces over the years. And one of the people involved in the translation is a scholar named Shams Inati. It's a female, Shams Inati, and then she did the physics, I think, and then the metaphysics also. And there's then there's the logical portion. Someone translated I mean, it's out there. If you have access to a good library, you can probably find. Anyhow, so these people were involved in this, and Mir Findiriski is another figure, like akin to Bahadi al-Amili and Mir Damad. But he has one distinguishing feature, that he had also gone and lived in India for a time. Yes, and so he was familiar with Indian thought. And apparently he even wrote on some commentaries on some Indic works, which had originally been in Sanskrit. Mir Findiriski, yes. But these works were not published. I first learned of this in a book I read a long time ago when I was just a teenager, by Sayyid Hussein Nasr, in which he mentions this in a footnote. And he mentions that someone named Fathullah Mujtaba'i is working on Mir Findiriski, and I tried to search in interlibrary law and didn't find anything. Apparently, Mr. Mujtaba'i never produced anything, or if he did, I'm not aware of it. But then later, apparently, there has been some kind of a dissertation written on Mir Findiriski and his contributions, and again, if you have access to the ProQuest database, if you're interested, I can get you the details. But these are the kind of people that were flourishing there at the time. In the Safavid period also, Shiism becomes the official school of law or madhab in Iran. The Safavids, it's interesting that Iran actually, before the Safavids, was very much a majority Sunni region. And they introduced Shiism, Twelver Shiism, and this is really the first time in history that the Twelver Shiites really get their own polity, at least since Ali ibn Abi Talib, if you interpret Ali ibn Abi Talib as they would. If you don't, you don't, but anyhow. And before that, you had the Ismaili Fatimid state in Egypt. You had Zaydi states and statelets and so forth. So they actually didn't have Shi'i ulama in Iran, and so they imported these ulama from Bilad al-Sham, from the Levant, Syria, Lebanon, what is today Syria, Lebanon, this area. And they mainly came from a place which is now in Lebanon called Jabal Amil. And that included Baha'u'ddin al-Amili. He came to Iran when he was young. He was maybe 9 or 10 years old. And he came with his father. His father was a very famous Shi'i legal scholar. And so then they put in this whole system. And so these people really emerge at a time of high kind of efflorescence of all of this, where all of this is starting to bloom and flower and bear fruit. And to get now to the philosophy, what is extremely important is this distinction, yes, and we'll end up on a good note, this distinction between wujud and mahiyya. This becomes very important. This distinction is there. It's recognized in Aristotle, but he doesn't really do much with it the way the Muslims do. It's there in Farabi, Ibn Sina. But when it comes to really Mir Damad, and then Mullah Sadra, it's really Mir Damad who formulates the problem in the way that I'm about to formulate it. And that is that, all right, according to our conceptual analysis, we can analyze any contingent thing into wujud and mahiyya, into being and existence. That's in our mind. In the external world, however, we are confronted just by that one object, which is one single ontological piece. It's an ontological bicomposite in mental analysis. But in the external world, the question then is posed by Mir Damad. Which one of these two, if any, is more fundamental in the external world? Which is more real? Which is more fundamental? The term in Arabic is which has asala, which is asil, which is originary, which is more fundamental. Asl. Now obviously there are only 4 logical possibilities. Oh, perhaps we are now using Buddhist logic. I don't know. In reference to our earlier discussion. So there are only 4 logical possibilities. Either wujud is more fundamentally real in the external world, to the exclusion of mahiyya, or mahiyya, quiddity, is more real in the external world to the exclusion of wujud, or it is both, or it is neither. Now, and this is where we will conclude. Mir Damad said, it is mahiyya which is more fundamental in the external world. So did, it seems, Shihabuddin as-Suhrawardi also seemed to uphold this. What did Ibn Sina say? Question mark. We have to discuss that next time. In short, in one sentence, Ibn Sina can be interpreted to either way. Why? We will discuss in future, inshallah. All right, what about upholding both? There's only one person who ever said something like that, which I find contradictory, but anyway, someone did say it, and that was Sheikh Ahmed Ahsa'i of the Shaykhi school, which is a legitimate kind of philosophical, mystical kind of school or tendency in Twelver Shi'ism. It's a minority thing, but it's there, it exists. Did anyone say neither? Probably the Buddhists. But they're not in Islamic philosophy, right? So that's where we leave it. What did Mullah Sadra say? Mullah Sadra said it was wujud. Mullah Sadra, and that is his great thesis, that it's asalatul wujud, or wujud is more fundamentally real. And so what he said has tremendous resonance with what people like Muhyiddin ibn Arabi and the Sufis said. And so Mullah Sadra has a grand synthesis. He synthesizes everybody that comes before him. He synthesizes Ibn Sina. He synthesizes the Shiite theology of Nasiruddin al-Tusi, who died 672. He synthesizes the illuminative wisdom of Shihabuddin al-Suhrawardi, the unitary metaphysics of Ibn Arabi, and the teachings of the 12 Shiite Imams, all in a grand synthesis set out in his 9-volume work, Kitab al-Asfar al-Arba'a. And next time we will talk about Mullah Sadra and the Asfar. So stay tuned. Wallahu a'lam. Thank you.
So Mir Damad said Mahiyya is fundamental, Mullah Sadra said